My name is Aubrey Hendrick, the hostess of Tales from the Round Table, and this is the podcast for anyone curious about the history behind the legends of King Arthur, the people who wrote them, and what those stories can still tell us today. Welcome to the table. Episode 3. Appreciate, Appropriate, and Arthuriate. Part 2. Cultural appropriation! In the last episode, I announced that I was going to be launching a 6-part series about the evolution of the King Arthur character from its inception to the present. Through doing this, the goal is to see what roles Arthur fills in the tales in which he makes his appearance, and what this says about the people who initially wrote and heard these first tales. We'll also get to see how the Arthur character grew from his original characterization into the King Arthur we all know and love today. Today, in this episode, we're going to talk about the first cultures that adapted the Arthur stories to fit their audience and their agendas, namely the Normans. A brief table of contents for where we're going with this episode. We're going to start out by discussing the Latin sources, Saxon sources, and Norman sources for Arthur. Then we will transition to talk about how the Normans changed his character and why they did so. And then, as always, wrap up by talking about what this says about the character of Arthur. So, that table of contents is kind of misleading. I said that we were going to start with some Latin sources and Saxon sources for Arthur, but that's not entirely true. Let's break down what I mean by discussing some Latin stories. Maybe you noticed back in episode 1 that I mentioned some writings by a guy named Gildas who wrote De Excidio et Concusto Britanniae in Latin somewhere around AD 547. While the first Welsh sources that we have of Arthur don't appear until circa AD 600. In other words, Welsh sources about Arthur and Latin sources about Arthur were being written at the same time. Why? Well, keep in mind that at this period of history, Latin is the lingua franca, the language of trade and of the literate class. You have Britons telling stories about their island's hero, Arthur, in both their native language, Welsh, and in their second language, Latin. However, there are far fewer stories about him in Latin because the people writing in Latin are of the noble or monk class, the academic class, and they are far more interested in writing Bible stories and historical things. As a result, these Latin stories are not actually a part of the appropriation of Arthur's stories, since they are being written by Welsh people in their second language. Now, to transition to the shortest segment of this entire episode, the Saxons. What are the Saxon sources? Well, there are none. This is not surprising. Remember, the Saxons are invading the Isle of Britain and pushing out, sometimes violently, the Britons. Remember what we talked about in the last episode about the Welsh origins of Arthur? Arthur is a Briton warlord. He's the Saxons' enemy. It makes perfect sense then why we wouldn't see any Anglo-Saxon depictions of an Arthur figure for quite a few centuries. So, if the Latin speakers were not appropriating Arthur and the Saxons were not appropriating Arthur, who was? The Normans. To dig into who the Normans are and how they appropriated Arthur's stories, we are going to dig into one of the biggest turning points in the history of the Isle of Britain. The year, AD 1066. The event, the Norman Conquest. If you recall, in both of the earlier episodes, I've made a big distinction between calling it Britain and not England. Well, we are at the point where we can officially call most of the Isle England, because now in 1066, 500 years after the Saxon invasions, England has been settled by the Utes, Saxons, and ding ding ding, the Angles. So now it is Angleland. Between the years circa 500 to 1066 AD, the primary language in Britain was English. That's right, the Anglo-Saxons spoke English. Of course, you still have people writing in Latin because that's the language of academia and recording for posterity, but people are predominantly speaking in English. More accurately, they are speaking what we today call Old English. Now, Old English is nothing like modern-day English. If you think the Declaration of Independence or Shakespeare sounds archaic, you have never read the OG version of Beowulf. Beowulf is the most famous example of Old English writing and poetry. And on my website, in the notes document for this episode, I have a link to the original Old English Beowulf text. And if you check that out, you will know exactly what I mean. Old English is a Germanic language, meaning it shares no real similarities with Latin languages. It has a lot more in common with modern-day German than anything else. And this makes sense, considering the Utes, Angles, and Saxons are coming from what is today Denmark and Germany. As a native English speaker, the only way I could learn to read or speak Old English would be to learn it as a second language. It is that different. It is so different that it was originally written in Futhorc, the runic alphabet that we associate with Norse, another Germanic language. Of course, once the Anglo-Saxons invaded Britain, they were exposed to Latin speakers, and their language adopted some Latin words and transitioned away from Futhorc into the Latin alphabet. So, why can't I, a native English speaker, speak or even read Old English? Well, you have the Normans to thank for that. The Normans came from Normandy, modern-day France, and they spoke a dialect of Old French. And what linguistic family is French a part of? You guessed it, Latin. When the Normans invaded, just like the Saxons before them, they brought their distinctive language, but they took it a step further. When William the Conqueror conquered England in 1066, he did something diabolical and stinkin' smart. He replaced all of the nobles, monks, and academics, the people who were literate and would have known how to write in English, with Norman nobles, Norman monks, and Norman academics. This meant that for literally 100 years of English history, no one is writing in English. The common people are still speaking it, of course, but the language isn't being written anymore, and the common people now have to learn to speak the language of their new rulers. As a result, the English language became Latinized. When people started writing in English again, literally 100 years later in the 13th century, it had changed so much that now it's literally a different language that we call Middle English, a Latin language, or at the very least, a language that's Latin adjacent. And that, my friends, is why you can't read Old English, but you can read the French and Spanish warning labels on your washing machine. Why did I go on this ridiculously long tangent? Because now you can better understand just how radically the Norman conquest shook the Isle of Britain. It changed everything. In the cycle that is human history, what the Saxons did to the Britons, the Normans did to the Saxons. The Saxons lost power, lost their academics and ruling class, and they lost a good chunk of their language. Now, what does any of this have to do with King Arthur? The Normans were the first ones to culturally appropriate the King Arthur tales. When the Normans arrived, the Welsh people were still telling stories about King Arthur. In particular, the Normans encountered a specific story about Arthur called Historia Regum Britanniae, or the History of the Kings of Britain, written by a cleric called Geoffrey of Monmouth. Now, Geoffrey of Monmouth is really significant, but to unpack why will take a while, so in the interest of time, I'm going to save that information for the next episode. What you really need to know for the purposes of this episode regarding the Normans is that the history of the kings of Britain was written in Latin in 1136 AD and then was translated in 1155 into a dialect of Norman French. And so now, for the first time, you have a story about King Arthur reaching other audiences outside of just the Britons and the Welsh. In particular, you have it reaching the French, both those living in England and those living in France itself. And this is where we finally get to look at those lovely French additions to what has finally become Arthuriana. As always, there are tons of sources, y'all, that are French that I am not talking about in this episode for the sake of time, such as the Vulgate cycle. The two that we are going to discuss here, I picked because I'm most familiar with them and I studied them the most. And they're also, to my knowledge, the oldest French sources, so there's that too. Both of these pieces are written in Old French. The first we'll discuss is a short, lovely piece called Landval. Landval was written by a woman by the name of Marie de France in 1180 AD. If you can guess by her name, she was initially from France. However, at the time of her writing this, she lived in England, possibly in the royal court. Landval is about a knight by the same name. In this brief story called A Lie, Landval is a young new knight in King Arthur's court. When we first meet Landval, he's not having a great time. He, King Arthur, apportioned wives and lands to all, save to one who had served him. This was Landval, whom he did not remember, and for whom no one put in a good word. Because of his valor, generosity, beauty, and prowess, many were envious of him, but who would have uttered a single regret if misfortune had befallen him. He was the son of a king of noble birth, but far from his inheritance, and although he belonged to Arthur's household, he had spent all his wealth, for the king gave him nothing, and Landval asked for nothing. Landval lives as a foreigner knight in King Arthur's court, but Arthur overlooks him. His fortunes change when he is visited by a fairy maiden who becomes his lover. To briefly run through the events of this story, Landval is wrongly accused of trying to seduce Guinevere. He's arrested, but then he is acquitted by his fairy lover and leaves with her to go to Avalon, where they live happily ever after. What's important about this, for our sake, is the character of Landval and the character of Arthur. In that earlier excerpt, we see that Landval served King Arthur, but Arthur forgot about him and didn't reward him. He is a persecuted hero. He doesn't do anything wrong, but people are jealous of him and no one believes him when he is wrongfully accused of trying to seduce the queen. As a foreigner, he doesn't have anyone to plead his case. We also see from this same excerpt the kind of king that Arthur is. Not a good one. Remember in the last episode, the segment that we read from one of the poems about leaders rewarding followers with gifts of horses? It's the same idea here. In this culture, kings are expected to reward those who follow them. But Arthur consistently overlooks Landval. Furthermore, in spite of Landval's character, he doesn't believe Landval when the knight protests his innocence. As a result, this is the first glimpse we get of an Arthur character who's not a good king. The second piece that we'll discuss here is probably the one piece of French Arthurian literature that we all know, and that is Chrétien de Troyes' The Knight of the Cart. This was written by Chrétien somewhere between 1177 and 1181 and finished by a man named Godefroy de Lagny. Not only is it written in Old French, but it was actually written in France. As a result, the Arthurian stories have finally moved out of the Isle of Britain and have been carried to France. What makes this story most important for future Arthuriana, and the reason why I'm sure many of you know it, is that this is the first time, to our knowledge, that the character of Lancelot shows up. This story is also important because it was heavily inspired and possibly drafted by a woman, Marie, the Countess de Champagne. She was Chrétien de Troyes' patron, and she probably invented Lancelot. According to Chrétien, although he wrote it, she asked for it and gave him the bones of the story. As a result, the story is actually hers. Now, for the story itself, it's long. Guinevere is kidnapped by a guy named Meleagant, and Arthur doesn't go after her because, he's a bad husband. But this mysterious, gorgeous white knight does. You want to guess who it is? Yeah, that's Lancelot. Lancelot goes to the magical kingdom of Gore to save Guinevere. He fights Meleagant, wins numerous times, has a night of passion with Guinevere, is kidnapped by Meleagant and kept in a tower a la Rapunzel. He escapes the tower with help from Meleagant's sister, wins a jousting tournament, and eventually kills Meleagant and rescues Guinevere. Yeah, I know, that's a lot. For our purposes, we're going to focus on Lancelot and Arthur as characters. When Meleagant first comes to Arthur's court, Chrétien tells us that there were many barons in the great hall, and also the queen and, I believe, many courteous and beautiful ladies conversing in elegant French. So, once again, this King Arthur is not Brittonic or Welsh in the slightest. He is speaking in French, just like the English court would have been doing in this time period. When Meleagant comes, he taunts Arthur about the fact that he's kidnapped a lot of Arthur's people. So, remembering the violent individual that Arthur was in our last episode, how he's a Red Reaper and all that jazz, how do you think Arthur's going to respond? You thought wrong. Here's Arthur's response. The king replied that he had to endure what he could not change, though it much grieved him to have to do so. And then, after Meleagant kidnaps Guinevere, no one's grief was strong enough to prompt him to follow after her until Sir Gawain addressed to the king, his uncle, in private. Lord, you have behaved like a child, and I am astonished. Yeah, not really a great look, Arthur. So this version of King Arthur is pretty stinking weak. He's letting Meleagant walk all over him, and then he doesn't even go save his wife. Like, homie, I'm not excusing the fact that Guinevere cheats on you with Lancelot, but Arthur, if you had been a good husband, she would have never been in a compromising position. This Arthur is a wimp. So different from the Welsh Arthur. What about Lancelot? Well, Lancelot, like Lanval, is a newcomer. He's the heroic outsider who comes into a court that is weak, and he is strong enough to defeat Meleagant, win the love of Guinevere, and save her. He is strong, good-looking, kind, passionate, and unstoppable with a sword. He stands in sharp contrast to the Arthur that we see in this tale. What do these two stories, Lanval and the Knight of the Cart, say about the character of Arthur? I'm pretty sure you can guess. They don't have a good opinion of him, and this is the first time that we see that. Arthur is no longer the crazy warlord that we all knew from his original tales in Welsh mythology. Now, as the tales are being adapted into French by French authors, he's pretty weak and unimpressive, a far cry from the warrior we knew. He's also not even really a warrior. He's a traditional king now, an English king. Now, for our final question, what does this tell us about the people who wrote these tales and would have heard them for the first time? Well, keep in mind what we talked about earlier about the Norman conquest of 1066. It makes sense that Arthur would be presented as weak and ineffectual because the French have just conquered most of the Isle of Britain. Their perspective of the people they just conquered is not going to be very high. However, these writers also did something profoundly relatable in a good way. The writers that we discussed in this episode Marie de France, Chrétien, and Marie the Countess de Champagne, they didn't see themselves in the Arthur stories as they previously existed. So what did these people do? They invented new stories using what already existed. They created new characters that they could relate to. Marie de France was an outsider in the English court. When she says things about Lanval like, "Now he was in a plight, very sad and forlorn. Lords, do not be surprised. A stranger bereft of advice can be very downcast in another land when he does not know where to seek help." It's very likely that she's talking about her own experience. In writing the story of Lanval about an overlooked and persecuted outsider finally having a happy ending, maybe that's a way for her to deal with very real problems that she was experiencing. The same is possibly very true of Marie the Countess de Champagne. While I 100% do not condone having an affair, it's likely that Marie was in an arranged marriage. In this time period, women didn't have very much control over who they married. Most marriages among the nobles were political, so it wasn't uncommon to just not be in love with the person you married or even really know them. As a result, as tragic as it is that an affair is part of this story, perhaps the story of Guinevere having this affair with Lancelot, who is much better than her husband, actually loves her and actually pursues her to save her from the guy who kidnapped her, is a way for women like Marie to feel like they have agency in their own lives and are worthy of being loved. Even though these stories were written almost 1,000 years ago, we can see that these people weren't really any different from us. They wanted to feel like they belonged and were seen, and they wanted to experience real love and feel treasured by their spouse. At the end of the day, no matter what culture they become a part of, King Arthur's stories still touch on basic human hopes and desires. And that, I think, is why we still find them so enduring. I'm Aubrey Hendrick, and you've been listening to Tales from the Round Table. See you again in a couple weeks. Thanks so much for listening to my podcast. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me on the Contact Me page of my website, aubreyhendrick.com. Also, if you're curious in any of the research that I used to put together this episode, you can find that on the podcast page of my website. I'd also be curious to hear what you'd like to hear an episode about. Finally, I'd like to wrap up by thanking Dr. Britt Mize of Texas A&M University for pointing me in the right direction with my research. That's it for me, folks. I'll see y'all again in a couple weeks.